there, spooky friends, and welcome to the first episode of October of the Scaryish podcast. I'm Rob. Okay. I'm Robin Grace. This is Adam Diaz.
Hello.
And today marks the first episode that's going to be released this month, right?
Indeed. Yeah, October's a big month. It's the birthday month for Robin. Her birthday starts October 1st and ends October 31st. So everyone can wish Robin a happy birthday, basically, for 31 straight days. Apologies for my soft woo. We are recording at like 3:30 a.m. Don't want to wake up doggos or spooky mom, so keeping it a little bit quiet. But yeah, first episode for the month means we're going to give some shout-outs really fast. And I want to give those shout-outs to Ethan, Catherine, Sam, and Andrew, and Jessica. Thank you so much for being patrons over there at patreon.com/scarishpodcast at the shout-out level or above. We sincerely appreciate it, and it makes things a whole lot easier on us when it comes to doing pretty much everything for Scaryish content.
Yeah, we're super thankful for you amazing patrons who go above and beyond to support us. I'm going to get into my topic, even though it's like the longer one. I'm going to go first because it's depressing and yours ends like, well,
my ends on a pretty cool note. So.
All right. Okay, so this episode, I'm going to go with an old school true crime, straight up killer. I'm going to preface this with this person is a killer, rapist, child murderer, cannibal person.
Wow, it's a lot of stuff.
And this being a Scaryish / ghost / true crime type podcast, if that's not something that you're okay with hearing about, I recommend a different episode because he is just an awful human being.
Or skip to my topic. I don't have any of those things in my topic.
Okay. Yeah, this one's definitely not unicorn and rainbows. This one is the story of Albert Fish, known by names such as the Gray Man, or the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, and even simply as the Boogeyman.
That's a lot of intense nicknames. The Boogeyman, a vampire, a werewolf. It seems like he's horrible in a lot of different ways here.
Pretty much. So this guy's name was Hamilton Howard Fish. He was born May 19th, 1870 in Washington, D.C. His father was of English ancestry. His mother was Scots-Irish. When Fish was born, his father was 75.
Wow.
Whopping 43 years older than his mother. He was the youngest of 4 surviving children. He actually took the name of Albert sometime later, named after one of his siblings that had actually passed away. Apparently, he didn't like getting called ham and eggs all the time at the orphanage he spent a lot of his childhood in.
Wow. Kids are good kids. They always have to come up with some shitty nickname to taunt someone with.
Hamilton's such a good name. Just because I love Hamilton, the play. Anyway, Fish's family had a history of mental illness. His uncle suffered from mania. One of his brothers was actually in a mental institution. One of his sisters was diagnosed with having a mental affliction. Back in the day, I mean, they were just telling women, like, you have a mental affliction if you were, like, speaking your mind, you know?
Yeah. You have an opinion? Oh, yeah, put her in the hospital.
His mother suffered from oral or visual hallucinations, and a couple other family members suffered from varying mental illnesses. Probably not the best environment to grow up in. His father died October 16th, 1875, after which his mother put him in St. John's Orphanage, which was a place that he was frequently abused in. He was there until around the age of 9, but during that time he saw a lot of abuse and a lot of children doing bad things. So it wasn't just the adults doing the bad stuff, you know, it's like there's obviously going to be bullies and things like that. In around 1880, his mother had obtained a government job and was well enough to take him out of the orphanage. Just a note that back in the day, it was kind of common for people to kind of drop their kids off at an orphanage if they didn't make enough money. They couldn't raise their own kids, right? So they dropped them off at an orphanage. And then when they finally had enough money, a good job or whatever, they'd just come back years later to pick their kids up.
You just come back and get your kid.
Pretty
what happens
much.
if your kid's been adopted from the orphanage by someone else?
I'm sure there was some agreement or something like that. Like they signed paperwork that doesn't have, and I'm sure back then there weren't a lot of people that wanted to adopt kids, you know?
I don't know about that. I feel like there were still people that wanted to adopt kids that could not have kids since it was before like fertility treatments or any of that stuff.
Right, but like it's not, I bet adoption was not common. There's a reason why Annie is a movie with a bunch of orphans that just hang out, you know? Because people don't just adopt every single child that's in an orphanage.
Oh,
it just
obviously they
doesn't
don't adopt every single child from an orphanage. I'm just saying, like, adoption existed.
Oh, yeah, adoption existed, but I'm saying, like, he got screwed. And I bet a lot of kids that were just left there, people weren't going to be like, oh, yeah, I want that kid. I'm sure his odds of someone coming in being like, oh, I want to adopt that kid was real low, you know? Anyway, in 1882, Fish began a relationship with a telegraph boy who introduced him to some fetishes, some gross fecal type fetishes, as well as other things. It was real gross. Seriously, reading through all this stuff, I was like, this nasty. At this young age, he started checking out public bathhouses where he'd spend a good portion of his weekends watching the boys there. And then as he got older, his deviancies kind of increased. Like, they just got worse and worse and worse. So 1882, he's only 12. He's only 12 and he's already starting to do this stuff. 1890, he's 20, right? And he moves to New York City. And maybe not moves, but he definitely travels to New York City pretty often. I don't know how far away from Washington, D.C. that is. Maybe a few hours. I don't know. They didn't have like fancy cars like we have now, so I don't know how long it takes. But yeah, so he's in New York City. He becomes a prostitute and starts fulfilling a lot of these sick fantasies that he has of like rape and things like that. When he's 28, his mother sets him up in an arranged marriage with Anna Mary Hoffman, who's 9 years younger than he is. Together they have 6 kids. So
wow, that's a lot of kids.
Anna, Albert, Eugene, Gertrude, Henry, and John. Despite having been married and creating this family, he continues to further his inappropriate fantasies. He was a pedophile, continuing to molest young boys. At some point, a male lover takes him to a wax museum where he develops a fascination with the bisection of a penis and evolving to sexual mutilation in general.
Good God.
Yeah, so he is into weird shit. 1903, he's arrested for grand larceny, which means he stole something pretty big. 1910, when he's working in Wilmington, Delaware, he meets a 19-year-old man named Thomas Kedden. He took Kedden to his home and they have sex, and then it's not sure if it's forced or not, as he was supposedly mentally disabled in some capacity. About 10 years later, Fish takes Kedden to quote-unquote an old farmhouse where he tortures him over the span of 2 weeks. This torture includes mutilation. Fish was definitely super fucked up. I don't even consider him a human being for everything that he did, right? He got off on torturing this guy. Though he had originally intended to kill him and dismember him, he thought the weather was too hot. The temperature was too hot for him to do that. So he wraps up the wound from, he like cuts half the guy's penis off. Like wraps his wound, gives him $10, kisses him goodbye, and leaves.
Wow.
He never finds out what happens to him after he leaves, and he never tried to find out either. Who knows if he bled out or died? You know what I mean? I don't know. In January of 1917, Fish's wife left him for a handyman that had been boarding with them. So 1917, he is 47. His wife was 9 years younger than him, so she was only 38.
Correct.
Fish was the one that ended up raising the children alone after that. According to Fish's statement in a newspaper, she left him and took everything they owned with her.
So she took everything but the kids.
Yeah.
And she left these kids to be raised by a murdering, rapist, pedophile.
Yeah.
Wow.
So after this happens, he begins to have hallucinations himself. One of these hallucinations resulted in him having wrapped himself up in carpet because he was following the instructions of John the Apostle, apparently. Following the hallucinations came his fascination with self-harm. What he would do is embed needles into his own groin and abdomen.
Oh my God.
There's actually an x-ray. You can see this x-ray of Fish's pelvis where you can see more than 24 needles embedded in his body. It is so horrifying to look at. And it's just the idea, right, that this guy just put them there and left them there. He also would hit himself with a nail-studded paddle and would insert wool soaked in lighter fluid in his butt and set it on fire.
This is just so horrible.
It is he is fucked up. He was pretty much that guy from Da Vinci Code who performs like self-flagellation on himself.
I mean, he had some moments in that movie, but I don't remember him putting fire
no,
stuff
no,
up
no.
his butt and lighting it on fire.
No, but I mean, he hurt himself.
Like, he abused himself, absolutely. I know what you're saying. I'm just saying this guy is a step above.
Yeah. It's never thought that he actually abused his own kids, but he did have them and their friends. Like, he tried to talk the kids and their friends to hit him, like spank him with that nail-studded paddle. So that must have been a weird childhood for his kids. Eventually, he grew an obsession with cannibalism, even preparing meals consisting of raw meat. He would sometimes serve these type of meals to his kids, supposedly. In 1919, he stabs a boy in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., and he targeted those kids that he felt wouldn't be missed, that people wouldn't find important or anything like that. He went as far as to pay boys to find other children for him. He tortured and murdered a couple children brutally. He is an absolute monster, like, for real, monster. On July 11th, 1924, he finds an 8-year-old Beatrice Keel playing on her parents' farm alone on Staten Island, in New York. And he offers her money in exchange for helping him look for some rhubarb. And she's just 8, right? So she's like, oh, yeah, sure, yeah, whatever. She almost left with him, but her mother came out and chased Fish away, thankfully. He returned later to their barn and tried to sleep there, but was discovered by Beatrice's father and was forced to leave. 3 days later, Fish kills a Frances McDonnell while on Staten Island. So she was very lucky that her mom came out and was like, get the fuck off my property, right? During 1924, at the age of 54, this guy's 54, Fish, suffering from psychosis, believed that he was being commanded by God to torture and mutilate children. He molested a child named Cyril Quinn. Quinn and his friends were playing together when Fish came by and asked them if they had eaten lunch. They said no, so he invited them to his apartment for sandwiches. While these boys were kind of playing around, they moved his mattress, under which they found a knife, a handsaw, and a meat cleaver. Luckily, they were able to escape and run out of there before they were murdered, right? On May 25th, 1928, Fish saw an ad in the classifieds that read, young man, 18, wishes for a position in country, Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street. So this guy's just looking for a job, right? Gives the address and everything. So 3 days later, Fish arrives at the Budd residence in Manhattan with the, story that he wanted to hire Edward. And it's obviously a ruse. He introduces himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Farmingdale, New York.
The name he made up was Farmingdale. I'm sure that's an actual city. If it's not, though, I'm going to be like, wow, that's just lazy.
He promised to hire Edward and his friend Willie and that he would send for them in a few days. He had originally planned to tie Edward up and mutilate him, letting him bleed to death. That was his plan, what he was going to do with Edward. Fish didn't show up, but sent a telegram setting a later date that he'd come by. When he returns, he meets Edward's younger sister, Grace. And so upon meeting this 10-year-old, he changes his target. He's like, I'm not going to target Edward anymore. So he convinces their parents that he had actually had his niece's birthday party that he had to go to, and convinced them to allow Grace to attend this party with him. When Grace left with Fish that day, she never returned. So somehow, police decided Charles Edward Pope, this 66-year-old superintendent, was the suspect, and they arrest him on September 5th, 1930. He is accused by his estranged wife. So his wife was the one that was his estranged wife is like, He's probably the one that did that.
And he's not.
So he spends 108 days in jail between the arrest and the trial on December 22nd, 1980, and he's found not guilty because he didn't do it. On February 6th, 1930, Fish remarries to an Estella Wilcox, but they get divorced after a week.
She knew something was up.
So there's
real
something
quick.
wrong, right? It's like, that's not a good sign. If you get married and you divorce within a week, I bet she found something and she was just like, this is not right. Or maybe like a tool covered in blood or some messed up shit, right? Fish was arrested in May of 1930 for sending an obscene letter to a woman who answered an ad for a maid. He was arrested again in 1931, and after that 1931 arrest, he was sent to Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital for observation. He's 61 at this point, and he's still doing this stuff. You know what I mean? I don't know, maybe at 60, I'll also be fucking still weebing it. Who knows?
Weebing it? That's hilarious.
In November of 1934, an anonymous letter was sent to Grace's parents that led police to Fish. In this letter, it's a long-ass letter. I was not going to read it word for word, but you can find it word for word on the internet if you guys want. In the letter, it's just a bunch of very random information. Like, I started reading it and I was like, I'm so confused right now. It's a bunch of very random information at first, information about stuff going on in the world, different observations, then a lot of talk about a bunch of different children. So there's a lot of stuff about all these different children and things that were done to these children. There's talk about eating them, which is very fucking gross. Because it goes into way too much detail for that. So
did he send this letter like leading them to himself?
Yes.
Okay, that's fucking crazy.
Yeah. So it's in his handwriting and it still has like his grammatical errors and stuff like that. The addresses are included within this letter, dates all up to what happened when Grace disappeared and what he did with her, and to her. So it's like, it walks through like when they left, like the meal they had, and then everything leading up until what happened, right? All the gory, fucked up details about everything he did. Police investigated each little part of the letter to try and find who it was. The letter was delivered in an envelope with a logo with the letters NYPCBA. So that stood for New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. A janitor at that company said that he had taken some of the stationery from work home, but left it at the rooming house when he moved out. The landlady said that Fish checked out of that same room a few days later. She said that Fish's son sent him money and he had asked her to hold his next check for him. So William F. King, the chief investigator for the case, waited outside this room for Fish to return for his money, right? Fish agrees to go in for questioning, but after he agrees, he freaking whips out a razor blade against this freaking cop. So King disarms this 64-year-old man, and takes him in for questioning to the police. Fish didn't deny anything. When asked about Grace, he just told them that he hadn't meant to kill her originally, but actually was aiming for Edward, her brother. He also made a point to say that he never actually sexually assaulted her. I think in the letter, it said like she died a virgin. It's real fucked up. He did admit to sexual gratification during the physical assault and murder though. So he got off on the fucked up parts. I mean, the whole thing's fucked up, but it's like he got murder boners. That was like his thing. It wasn't until after his arrest that other crimes came to light, like that of Francis McDonald that I said earlier from Staten Island. He was 9. He was a 9-year-old that went missing July 14th, 1924, so 10 years prior to Fish's arrest. A search was conducted after McDonald didn't come home, so they searched for him, only for his body to be found hanging by a tree in a wooded area near his home.
Jesus Christ.
He'd been sexually assaulted and strangled by his suspenders, 1920s, so I'm sure a lot of kids wore suspenders back then. He had been cut up all over, his hamstring almost being completely stripped of the flesh. So, like, where is that? Behind your leg?
Yes.
Yeah. Fish denied being involved with this at first, but later stated that he had intended to castrate the boy but fled when he heard someone coming. So it's like he didn't want to admit it, And then afterwards, he was like, but I wanted to run away because I heard something. McDonald's friends told the police that an elderly man with a gray mustache took him. Hence the nickname, the Gray Man. Witnesses that saw Fish that day said everything about him seemed faded and gray. So he was just this probably miserable looking old man or something.
It's weird because in this series that I've read, they have the name the Gray Man. I think I've mentioned it to you before. And they're people that don't have souls. And I think that's actually an appropriate name for this guy because he seems to be quite the horrific human being that I can't even imagine this stuff. It's just stuff that's unimaginable that he seems to be doing for sexual gratification for decades. And it's so horrific, man.
So once the case is brought to attention again after the murder of Grace Budd, witnesses were able to come out and positively identify Albert Fish as the one that they saw that day. Along with McDonald, he also confessed to the killing of Billy Gaffney. So on February 11th, 1927, so that's 3 years after the McDonald murder, Billy Gaffney, 4 at the time, was playing in the apartment hallway in Brooklyn of their apartment building with a 3-year-old named Billy Beaton and his 12-year-old brother. When the 12-year-old brother walked away back to the apartment or something like that, the 2 younger kids disappeared. So they disappeared. Beaton, though, was later found on the roof of the apartment building. When asked what happened, he simply said that the boogeyman took Gaffney away.
That's so fucking terrifying.
So
man.
His body was never recovered, ever. There were a number of suspects for his murder, but when Joseph Meehan, a random guy that was on the trolley, saw a picture of Fish in a newspaper, identified him as the old man that he saw that day with a quiet little boy on the trolley. So this boy had been crying for his mother, and the guy dragged this boy off of the trolley. That's what was so memorable about it for him. And so things kind of fell into place, and eventually Fish wrote a letter to his lawyer describing everything that he did to that kid, which is, again, absolutely fucking awful.
Right.
Fish's trial for Grace Budd's murder began March 11th, 1935. Psychiatrists testified about his mental state and his sexual fantasies, including sadism, masochism, the flagellation part of it, exhibitionism, pedophilia, necrophilia, and so on. It's just like this guy has so many things fucked up in his head, right? Apparently, there were no precedents set for someone with this many sexual abnormalities in medical records. He was just somebody that had so many different strange sexual deviancies. They were just like, what?
They weren't even like fetishes. They were just like bizarre ways to be broken as a human being.
Yeah.
They'd never met a monster like him.
So Fish had an obsession with religion and the idea that these actions were quote-unquote sacrifices for his own sins, and that the angels would prevent his actions if God was actually against it. So that was his way of
justifying it,
what he was doing, right? Psychiatrists supported all of these ideas on the reasoning behind Fish's thought process. So they were just like, this guy is not right in the head at all. He is nuts. There were a lot of witnesses that came out to point out situations in which Fish did inappropriate things, and he was just not quite right. Fish's 17-year-old stepdaughter described how Fish taught her and her siblings games involving masochism and child molestation. So it's like, he was just not right, you know? Everything was, so there was something off. Jurors agreed that Fish was insane, but they felt that he should be executed anyway. They found him sane and guilty despite the honest belief that he was batshit crazy. They just didn't think that he deserved to live after all of that. They wanted him dead. Right. The judge ordered that he be sentenced to death. Fish arrived at prison March 1935. He was executed in January of the next year by electric chair. I think it was like 3 minutes before he died.
Wow.
He was buried in the Sing Sing Correctional Facility Cemetery in New York. Supposedly, his last words were, quote, "I don't even know why I'm here," end quote. And when I read that, I was like, that definitely has a number of different ways you could take that sentence. One could be like, he has no remorse, but then the other is like,
he's old and confused and doesn't even know what's going on.
That's not what I was thinking. I was thinking more of like, why am I still alive? Like, he doesn't even want to be alive anyway. Like, why was he born? Why, you know what I mean? And maybe that's why he into self-harm, and why he was like, I'm a fucked up person. I don't know why I exist type thing.
I also took it as he doesn't think he did anything wrong. Like, God would have prevented it, you know? That's what he had already justified to himself, and maybe that's how he felt. It's hard to know. Either way, I'm happy that's where he was sitting when he said that.
Yeah. So Fish's lawyer had a final statement that was written by Fish hours before he died. And he stated, the lawyer said, quote, I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read, end quote. Like, that shit is fuck nuts.
So just one more horrifying letter before he went, and the lawyer decided not to inflict it upon the world after he was gone.
That's just, ugh. There's so much that you can read about this whole thing, and it's too much, you know, where I was just like, I don't want to read this, and I read this shit all the time.
You had to edit out the more horrific details.
And I was just like, it's too much. I can't make other people hear the horrible things that he did. It's just awful.
Well, I'm happy that I'm going second, because mine definitely has a lighter tone to it, even though it's not the lightest of tones. So probably a good idea that you went first. That was some really good research and a solid story about a horrific human being that I'm glad was executed because of all the horrible things he did. So
yeah,
that is pretty shocking shit, but good stuff. Good topic, Robin.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good fight. Good night.
All right. And before we get into my topic, we're going to take a quick commercial break. And we are back. So this week I thought about what I wanted to cover for the beginning of Spooktober, or whatever we're calling it this year. There's a few things that I've thought about covering for like the last few months, in fact, but there is one incident I thought was the right combination of kind of humorous and horrifying in a very real way. That would be a solid start to the month, at least for me. And while this topic does not involve a ghost, it does involve an event that happened, and that was nearly one of the worst disasters of the 20th century. And it has a John Travolta reference in it, so that's always fun. So without further topic teasing, I present to you the Palomares incident. I will also say the pronunciation of Palomares. There's a bunch of different people who say it, and they say it based off the region that they are from. This particular word is from Spain, so there's probably an accent to it. I'm just saying it in the way that my stupid broken tongue says it, so please do not be offended. This topic is something...
you can't roll your R's.
I cannot roll my R's, no. This topic, I don't think you're actually supposed to roll your R for this one, but there's just like an accent that I was hearing when I was watching like foreign language YouTube videos, where I was like, I can't do it, I'm just going to say Palomares, because I feel like that's what I would say like in real life, so. And this is real life, I think, I hope. Anyways, this topic is something that I stumbled across while doing a different topic, actually.
What?
But I cannot for the life of me remember which one it was. The incident takes place in 1966. Y'all remember 1966, right? The average cost of a new house was $14,200.
I fucking wish.
An average cost of a new car, $2,650.
Oh, my Lord.
Gallon of gas cost 32 cents. And a weird show set in space called Star Trek debuted on television.
What?
It was 1966 when cigarettes got a warning label for the first time, which is just so lame, right? And Mike Tyson was born in 1966. He would go on to hit people so hard, they would literally explode. He's a very strong man.
They would literally explode.
That was the hardest part about a Mike Tyson fight. There was two things when you watch Mike Tyson fight. One, the fight was going to end very quickly and people were disappointed because they paid for a long fight. And two, if you were in the first 6 rows, you were in the splash zone because that person was going to pop.
What the fuck?
Another thing that happened in 1966 was the Palomares incident. This actually happened on January 17th, to be exact. And it was a little nuts. So, when we talk about things that are scary, we usually dabble into true crime like Robin just did, or paranormal. But during this time period, 1966, there was a different kind of fear that was just sort of persistent and present in the background of the lives of Americans and pretty much everyone else for that matter. And that was the fear of thermonuclear war. You see, there was this thing back then called the Cold War. And some of our younger listeners might not know what that is.
It's not just a Call of Duty game.
And without getting too deep into the history of the era, the Cold War was a war that took place between the human beings of Earth and the frost giants of Jotunheim. So, pretty intense stuff. Wait, hang on. No, that one hasn't happened yet. I'm thinking way too far ahead. The one I'm talking about is between the United States of America and their allies and the Soviet Union and their allies. And it wasn't so much a war in the traditional sense of an active battle as it was two global superpowers engaging in espionage and political posturing to basically show that they had the upper hand on the world stage and basically threatening each other the entire time. Like, if you can imagine two people pointing guns at each other, that they're going to kill the other one if they made a move they didn't like. And that would kill off the entire world if they did. And they did that for like 50 years. And because of this heightened state of tension between the countries, especially in the 60s, global nuclear war was always just a turn of a couple of keys away. Everyone knew it could just pop off at any minute. There was drills that people ran in school where you would hide under your desk in the event that there would be a nuclear bomb that went off. It wouldn't save you at all, but it was just something that they could do, essentially to keep the kids calm in their final moments, I suppose. So both countries were constantly performing various training exercises and missions to ensure that should the shit hit the fan, they would at least give as much destruction as they received. Basically, everyone wanted to be sure that the entire human race would be wiped out should one person decide to attack. One such mission during this time was known as, and I swear I'm not making this up, Operation Chrome Dome. Now,
that sounds so sick, dude.
Operation Chrome Dome was a mission that lasted from 1960 to 1968. And during those 9 years, and yes, it's 9 because you count the 0.
6. Okay. Yeah.
60, 61, 62, 63, you got it. B-52 bombers would fly continuous routes, so they would remain on continuous airborne alert in case of their need. Those routes would be from United States bases, sometimes in foreign countries, sometimes domestic bases, and they would fly to the Soviet Union's borders, and they'd basically fly along the border after that, and then they'd return to the base in which they came, or they'd stop at a different base that they were going to. It was basically a very intensely antagonistic, intimidating method during this Cold War. The thing about these missions is that sometimes the B-52s would have to fly a very long way to do this, and those things would burn through fuel quite quickly. I mean, they were as big as a whale, and they're about to set sail. I hate you so much for not getting that, because these are called B-52s, and I just quoted Love Shack, and you didn't get it. And I wrote here, side note, I swear to fucking God, if Robin doesn't get this joke, I'm quitting the show and moving away. So congratulations, This is the final episode of Scaryish. You'll never find me.
Okay, yeah, because the only words I know from Love Shack is...
Love Shack?
Yeah!
I hate you so much. Anyways, the planes would have to refuel during the mission because they were traveling so far, which means that they would refuel midair. Now, if you've never seen a plane refuel in midair, watching YouTube, or, let's be honest, watching the movie Air Force One, which is just such a good, cheesy action movie.
I love Air Force One.
It's such a good movie. The process that takes place is a very careful and very precise maneuver, and it also feels slightly sexual. I mean, it's very much described as when one plane loves another plane. The plane with more fuel extends its rod very carefully into the hole of the plane with less fuel and transfers its love to it.
The entirety of the sky becomes the Love Shack.
Wow, that's totally true. When it's done, it says thanks for the good time, and it leaves. And the plane that is now filled with new fuel and love can complete its super threatening mission. This is precisely what was supposed to happen on January 17th. In fact, the B-52 that we're talking about departed from North Carolina, and it had to be refueled twice in midair. It would travel all the way from North Carolina to the eastern border of the Mediterranean Sea to the land border that is now Croatia. And then it would fly up along the Croatian border, down again, and then basically return back to North Carolina. So that's a really, really long flight. So The first time it would get refueled was as it approached Spain, which is essentially the entrance to the Mediterranean. A fuel tanker would fly out from, I think it's Moron, Moron is how you spell it. I know it's not pronounced moron. That's the name of the base.
Okay.
In Spain, the fuel tanker would fly from and refuel this B-52 in midair. The first refueling went just fine. It went and did its super threatening mission. Pretty sure everyone flipped off the Soviet Union out the window. Everything was fine. Turned around, was heading home. As it approached Spain the second time, it would start to be refueled in midair over the Mediterranean Sea while it approached the country of Spain. And the second tanker was sent into the sky to refill. And this was happening at 10:30 a.m. on January 17th. The two planes met and started flirting. It was love at 31,000 feet in the air. The pilot of the B-52 states in regards to the refueling, quote, "We came in behind the tanker and we were a little bit fast." I mean, who isn't when it's new love, right? "And we started to overrun him a little bit. There is a procedure they have in refueling where if the boom operator feels that you're getting too close and it's a dangerous situation, he will call breakaway, breakaway, breakaway. There was no call for a breakaway, so we didn't see anything dangerous about the situation, but all of a sudden, all hell seemed to break loose." End quote. And indeed it did. The nozzle of the refueling boom struck the top of the B-52 fuselage. And the fuselage, to me, I never really knew what it meant until I Googled it today. It is essentially the main body of the aircraft. If you were to take the tail and the wings off, what is left, just the tube, basically, that's the fuselage.
Okay.
It's the main part. So when this boom hits the fuselage, it breaks a load-bearing component of the frame of the plane itself.
Oh, that plane's going down,
which
right?
causes the left wing to snap off. The left wing snapping off of the B-52 causes a significant explosion that was seen from a mile away. Because this B-52 was not the only B-52 running this mission. There was a second B-52 doing the exact same mission a mile behind, and they saw the explosion take place. The damage done to the nozzle that was coming from the tanker combined with the explosion so close caused a catastrophic reaction to the fuel tanker in the sky, which exploded. All 4 men aboard the fuel tanker died in the explosion. The B-52 broke apart with the explosion, but not entirely. The entire thing wasn't engulfed in the explosion. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They had 7 men aboard. 2 died in the explosion immediately. A First Lieutenant Stephen G. Montanus was seated on the lower deck of the main cockpit, and when he witnessed the explosion, he was able to eject himself from the plane, along with 5 other crew. Unfortunately for Stephen, after he ejected himself, his parachute malfunctioned and never opened, and he died. The other 4 crew members that were able to eject from the plane as it broke apart did survive the incident. 3 of them wound up in the Mediterranean Sea, while one of them drifted a little bit further and came down on land. He was actually unable to detach himself from his seat in the plane when he ejected, and it basically went with him all the way to the ground. He suffered additional injuries when he collided with the earth, but he did survive. Fishing boats that were just out in the Mediterranean Sea that saw the explosion were able to retrieve the parachuters who landed in the sea, while local villagers rushed to the one who had landed on the solid ground and rushed him to the hospital so he wouldn't die, basically. Now, aside from this being a horrific accident of 2 planes blowing up in the sky during the Cold War, you're probably wondering what makes this different than any other training accident that I could have covered. Why did I bring up the Cold War? Is the loss of human life in and of itself horrifying or terrifying enough that I'm trying to make some sort of point here about this being Scaryish? Well, not exactly. See, the thing about these missions that were being run, and the whole point of Operation Chrome Dome, wasn't just to intimidate, it was to constantly be ready in the case a thermonuclear device needed to be dropped. Which, of course, means there were 4 hydrogen thermonuclear bombs aboard the B-52 at the time it blew apart and broke up off the east coast of Spain.
Oh my okay.
It should be noted that each of those 4 bombs had a blast yield of 1,100 kilotons, or 1.1 megatons.
But they didn't go off.
And let me get to it. So,
Oh, jeez.
since it's hard to understand what that means, let me just put it this way. It's 85 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. And in this moment where I left the story, these 4 nuclear weapons are plummeting to Earth. This type of accident, one that involves nuclear weapons, but doesn't create the risk of a nuclear war, is referred to as a broken arrow. There's a different term if the nuclear weapon involved in the accident could generate a nuclear war, like in the movie The Sum of All Fears, where a bomb goes off.
Okay.
This means that a nuclear bomb has been involved in an accident or lost. That's what a broken arrow is. And yes, it is a real term. They did not make it up for the John Travolta, Christian Slater movie by the same name, Broken Arrow, that came out in the 90s. Also, interestingly enough, as I wrote that bullet point, I was watching the Vindicators episode of Rick and Morty, and Christian Slater does the voice of Vance Maximus, the Tony Stark ripoff, and I thought it was so interesting that I hadn't seen him or heard from him in so long except for that episode. It's almost like this topic was meant to be. Now, the bombs are built to not detonate unless armed. That does not mean that they aren't dangerous if they're accidentally dropped on an allied nation. And they do have a parachute built into them and they're literally built in case you want to have an air detonation, which can cause significantly more devastation than just letting it fall and collide to the ground.
Because it spreads the radiation.
Correct. Well, it spreads the blast itself. So that's something that's built into it. And in the case of an accident, the parachutes typically are set to deploy. So it's nice to know that these bombs were not armed. But it doesn't mean that these bombs are not going to hit the ground pretty damn hard. And there are regular explosives inside a nuclear warhead when armed that serve to compress the atomic material to a point of rapid expansion and reaction. That reaction is the nuclear blast that we are all familiar with. Because the weapons weren't armed, that reaction did not take place. If it did, you'd probably know about it the time we dropped 4 nukes on Spain.
Okay.
2 of the bombs, however, that fell to Earth, they impacted so hard that the regular explosives within the bomb that were set to blow up the payload, those blew up. The payload wasn't armed, so it wasn't going to have the standard nuclear reaction. But essentially what people saw was 2 planes explode in the sky, 2 planes that they knew to be bombers, one of which was a bomber. And then they saw missiles fall to the ground, and when 2 of them collided, there was an explosion. And because that explosion was surrounding radioactive material, it shot radioactive material over the countryside of Spain when it blew up, creating nuclear fallout, essentially over 2 square kilometers, which is not a full-blown Chernobyl. Obviously, it's not a very big area, comparatively speaking. But when you have a small fishing village in Palomares, Spain, it's going to become very notorious when you drop nuclear weapons on it and it contaminates the land. And 2 kilometers of land might not seem like a lot when you say it, but I grew up on half an acre of land, which was a lot of land. It took me 3 hours to mow it, okay? That's half an acre. What was contaminated in Spain was 495 acres of land. So it's still a big plot of land. One of the warheads, the third, wound up not detonating any of the explosives when it hit the ground and rolled or whatever, and wound up on a riverbed. And those 3 warheads, the 2 that detonated and the 1 that didn't, and wound up on the riverbed, were recovered within 24 hours. And that seems like pretty good response time.
Okay.
It is wartime, but let's be real. This is a pretty high-profile fuck-up. And you'd imagine all the people that are watching these things fall from the sky would be like, hey, I know where your bomb is at. Do you want to go fucking get it? So getting 3 of them, it's expected in my opinion. But it's still good that they got them. That said, there is one obvious problem here. There were 4 warheads. 3 of them were recovered in a day, but the 4th was not found by the end of that day. The people on the ground didn't find it. They had a massive search. They did, however, find the parachute tail plate from the device, but the device itself was missing. So they scoured the landscape looking for it, and after the device could not be located, searching this massive area of Spain, searchers began to postulate that maybe, even though the tail fin that contained the parachute was discovered on land, it's possible that it deployed properly, the warhead drifted out to sea. When it landed in the water, it broke off and basically washed ashore without the parachute. And they thought, well, if that happened, then it's in the Mediterranean Sea, which is, by the way, kind of fucking deep. So
Is it?
they got a few boats and they started looking. The United Kingdom kind of helped out with the recovery effort using some boats and some airplanes. And eventually the U.S. Air Force, realizing, man, this is a big mistake and we need some help, enlisted the U.S. Navy to help with the search. And they wound up bringing in experts and relocating individuals to live in Spain until the device was recovered. The Navy wound up dispatching 28 separate ships to help locate the device, along with the USS Forrestal, which is an aircraft carrier, which are the largest ships in the fleet. It is insane how big an aircraft carrier is and how big of a fuck up this was, where it had to be dispatched to the Mediterranean Sea instead of where it was supposed to be stationed to sort of oversee the events of the search. What they wound up doing is using a mathematical search pattern that would help them search such a huge area for the device and where it might be, but there's a caveat to using this mathematical search pattern. And that caveat is you need a point to base the search around. Someone to say, I think it's there, you know?
Right.
And the area was so big, they're like, we don't really fucking know. Enter Francisco Simo Orts.
Simo?
He was a local fisherman who claimed he believed to have seen the bomb enter the water on the day of the accident. The U.S. Air Force believed him, and they hired him on to assist in the operation, and the search pattern was used based off the location he suggested. Side note, the locals call him Bomb Paco or Bomb Frankie, which is a cool nickname either way. I'm going to go with Bomb Paco. In the end, it took 80 days before the device was finally located 2,550 feet underwater. They had to use a deep sea vehicle to go down there and grab the thing to bring it up.
Wow.
So they grab it, and wouldn't you know it, they get it halfway to the surface, and they fucking drop it. Again.
Imagine, though, being that pilot of that craft, right, that has to go down there and grab it. And you're like, I'm fucking grabbing a nuclear bomb from the bottom of the ocean. Like, holy shit.
And he probably felt pretty bad once he dropped it, because it took another 16 days.
What?
Before they located it again. This time it had drifted to a spot in the Mediterranean Sea that was 2,900 feet deep.
How did it drift so far?
Because the ocean has currents, and so does the Mediterranean Sea.
Isn't it heavy?
Yeah, it's heavy. So it
But
sinks, but it moves while it sinks.
Oh, my Lord.
So they formulated a plan to recover it, and it took them 5 days after discovering it to decide to enact the plan. They were basically going to have a different deep sea submersible. They'll be able to latch onto this a little bit better. Go down, latch onto it, and then they had like a tether that they lifted this thing to the surface with. They lifted it actually to 100 feet below the surface. They had divers go down, attach fucking cords basically to the nuke. Oh my God. Then brought the nuke to the surface. Then they brought the deep sea submersible to the surface as well. And they're like, cool. And they took it home. And then, as a wonderful postscript to this story, and this is my favorite part of this story, because dropping 4 nukes on Spain is pretty effed up. It's pretty frightening to think what would have happened if one of them would have been armed, because it would have just annihilated such a huge portion of the country, right. You know? So what happens in the postscript... The world would be
completely different today.
Everything would be completely different. So something very interesting happens. A few weeks later, at the United States District Court of the Southern District of New York, 2 men showed up with a very interesting claim. One of those men was Herbert Brownell. Herbert Brownell was 9 years removed from being the Attorney General of the United States of America. He was a very well-renowned, well-respected lawyer who had basically, in the Eisenhower administration, been the highest level of lawyer you could ever hope to achieve. And he's walking into this particular district court in New York. The other man that walked into the courtroom with him was Bomb Paco.
Why?
So there's this thing called salvage rights. It is customary under maritime law that a person who identifies the location of a ship or object to be salvaged has the right to a salvage reward if the location they provided leads to a successful recovery. The fee, basically assessed, or the award, depending on which side you're on, is normally 1% to 2% of that object's value if it is recovered successfully. At the time of the Cold War, it was very important to know how much shit costs. So a Y-1, or Yield 1, B-28 thermonuclear warhead, well, that sucker has a price tag of $2 billion.
What? What the fuck?
So they walked in and
we
said...
have so many nuclear bombs, and each one costs $2 billion.
I mean, this is 1966, and it cost $2 billion. So they walked in. He walks in with the former Attorney General of the United States, and they're like, we know how much that fucking thing costs, so you owe me at least $20 million. 1% of $2 billion is $20 million. And at this point, the case had definitely raised eyebrows. The entire incident was a huge fucking mess, and the U.S. military was hoping that everyone would just stop talking about it. They recovered the warheads. They didn't want to bring it up anymore. So the Air Force wound up settling out of court for an undisclosed sum of money. Bom Paco did state later in life, when he was asked about how much he got, that the Americans hadn't given him the amount of money they had promised him. But I am hoping that they eventually remedied that, because that is an awesome end to this insane story.
Yeah, that's crazy.
That, my spooky friends, is the Palomares incident.
That one's fun.
That one is fun because it's like, wow, we accidentally dropped 4 thermonuclear warheads on Spain, 2 of which blew up and contaminated a part of the land. They just didn't go nuclear, like fully nuclear. They're essentially dirty bombs we accidentally dropped. And in the end, one fisherman wound up making probably between $20 and $40 million off the U.S. government if they actually paid. I would imagine they still paid him quite a sum of money and then wound up like not delivering on a portion of it or something of that nature. But,
or they were just like, here's 15 million.
It's just such a bizarre freaking story. So I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope it was at least a decent balance to Robin's horrific tale of murder and all the other things that involved there. So either way, I really enjoyed this one, so I hope you did too.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really cool. It's freaking terrifying, and I can't believe that's how much our nuclear bombs cost.
Oh, they cost significantly more now, so.
Jesus.
But either way, thank you so much for listening to episode 199. If you have a story that is paranormal, supernatural, spiritual, coincidental, true crime, extraterrestrial in nature, feel free to reach out to us if you would like to share that story. We read those on the Storytime episodes, and you can email storytime@scaryish.com or go to our website, scaryish.com, and click on Contact Us. Fill out that form. It comes directly to us, or hit us up on any of our social medias. Twitter is @ScarishPod, Instagram is @ScarishPodcast, and Facebook is facebook.com/ScarishPodcast. Robin, for folks who would like to donate to us, how can they do so?
You can go to patreon.com/ScarishPodcast. Those are monthly donations. Tiers start at $1. You can be like those 4 patrons earlier, Jessica, Sam, and Andrew, Catherine, and Ethan, who support us big time on Patreon. And we really couldn't do it without everyone who helps and donates and is a part of our community. And we're really thankful. If you're not into the monthly donation type thing, you can also do Ko-fi, ko-fi.com/ScarishPodcast, and those are one-time donations. And we appreciate anything you guys do to support us. So tell your friends or family or significant other or whichever. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, sharing the show is incredibly helpful. Listening to us is we are so thankful that we have people that listen to us regularly, and it's always crazy to see those numbers come in and realize that people out there actually want to hear our voices. So thank you so much for that. It really does mean the world to us, and we couldn't do it without you. So I think that's everything we have, though, for episode 199. So, Robin, why don't you go ahead and sign us out?
Keep on creeping on, and we'll talk to you guys later.
Bye-bye.